So we're going to move into the morning session now, and I just want to say that the subject matter of this conference is us, and I say that in the broadest terms. I'm not mixed race, but I do count myself as part of the early generation of Korean adoptees who are very much impacted by the Korean War and its aftermath. The content of our conference is in many ways very deeply personal. The circumstances of our coming to be were beyond our control, and often painful and difficult to confront, even as adults. Yet we've come together today from across the country to share our stories and explore our collective history as adoptees, as mixed-race Koreans, and as Korean Americans. For many of us, our story begins with a phenomenon that's universal to foreign military occupations, the Camptown. And in Korea, the Camptown was an outgrowth of the division of Korea and the Korean War. So without further ado, let's begin. Our first presenter is Professor Suji Lee Gage. Professor Gage is an associate professor of anthropology at Ithaca College. She's been engaged in long-term research in South Korea and the United States, which is primarily concentrated on identity, race, belonging, and citizenship. Her work focuses on 4 groups: Amerasians, or mixed Asian and American descendants born in Asia that the US government has historically ignored; Korean women in the US military Camptown areas of South Korea that are ostracized for their relations with American soldiers; the US military stationed in South Korea and in the home front; and those within the political umbrella of Asian America. Professor Gage's talk today is entitled My Korea, My America, Korean Amerasians and the Everyday Politics of Belonging. Please welcome Professor Gage.
I want to thank you all for being here today. I'm especially honored too, and I want Laura Nelson to know that my Korean is worse than yours, so I hope that makes you feel better. But that was great. I'm just going to launch in, and I just want to give you a little forewarning. Even though I'm very funny, Milton can attest, I am a little funny at times. I have a hard time being funny in this particular talk. So I will try, but it's going to be a little hard. I actually renamed my title, and I renamed it because I saw how my friend Alina Kim's title was very similar in terms of her, and I thought, oh, no, I can't do that. So the title of my talk is actually My Korea, My America, Korean Amerasians, and the Cartographies of Identity. And I think that really speaks more to what I'm trying to address. So what do people make of places? What are the landscapes of our memory, our cartographies of belonging? So I found this talk especially difficult to write, and I had to first tackle why. And I quickly brushed it off initially as just the general anxiety when I give talks. I'm an extreme introvert, and even talking to more than 2 people is difficult for me. But then I moved a little deeper, and I reasoned that it would be the first time that the audience would be comprised primarily of people whose experiences intertwined with mine, not just professionally, but also personally. So I'm especially honored to be here and thankful for all the sponsors and all the hard work that I know it takes to make a conference like this, and especially to the Center for Korean Studies here at Berkeley, because it takes an incredible institution to recognize the importance of this kind of conference. So I want to thank you. And I did my postdoc here 7 years ago, and I'm just so delighted to be back, so thank you. The other thing that I want to point out here today is that you all here are the experts. You are the experts on your own lives. Earlier, I had a nice exchange with someone who's going to be on the panel later. I won't say this person's name. But she said, "You're the expert." And I was like, no, I'm not. Not in any way, right? I have a hard time dealing with my own life. But you are the experts of your own lives. You and your stories are our teachers. It takes incredible courage and resources to organize in such this way that allows for your stories to be heard on your own terms. Your stories carry a weight and a value to humanity and history. They acknowledge what my favorite activist, Helen Zia, calls MIH, or missing in history. So it took me a while to find my own courage to really think about why this talk was so hard. And I realized that the area of adoption and my own kind of, my friend who's an actress told me, use the word inhibition and it will, stop you. And you can take a breath. Inhibition. But it took my own courage and readiness to address a certain part of my own life. And so I've spoken to many mixed Korean adoptees, like everyone knows Milton Washington, I'm sure. But most of my focus on the adoptee experience has been historical. It's been in the archives. It's been in the media. It's been through reading amazing ethnographies like Alina Kim's and Arissa O's, moving films like Dion's, and just looking at news reports. So when I began graduate school 16 years ago, I ran across a book quite randomly in Bloomington, Indiana, and it was called The Unforgotten War, Dust of the Streets by Thomas Clement. Is he here today? He's not. And so this was a long time ago. And it was his book. In it, he writes this very vivid and troubling scene of the last time he saw his mother. How many of you have read the book? She lovingly zips up his little coat and told him to walk away and not look back. So his story moved me, but I realized pretty quickly it also stalked me. And at that time, I didn't want to open up that hidden story. So I sought safety in, this isn't working. In another topic. Is that good? Okay. One that connected my own experiences with Korean Amerasians still in Korea. I could do something critical and important, as it also linked with my own family and my own identity, all the while safely keeping the secret of my own mother leaving me. Inhibition, right? At age 3. Like a reversed mirror to Mr. Clement's story, I watched her. Good times, right? I watched her walking away from me in the dark of the night as a streetlight shadowed her with my baby brother embraced on her right hip. And her left hand holding my 4-year-old sister's hand. There was a split second where she turned her and looked back at me, but she quickly turned around and kept walking. So I watched them disappear into the darkness. I could more easily process and analyze the absence of my GI father, but not that. I was actually reunited with my mom and my siblings a few months later. But that experience was an unspoken secret, just until a few years ago. A secret that my mother only thought she knew. So at the age of 39, I finally asked my mom what happened. And she was shocked that I remembered because I was only 3. I won't tell you what she tells me, but the story, like so many others, is of course filled with many, many missing pieces that we will never know. But it's part of our story. It was and remains an experience that changed me. It altered my life, my relationships, and the way I navigate and see the world. So while my siblings didn't really have that same experience that I did, throughout our childhood we saw and experienced her struggles and challenges as a Korean immigrant and single mother, the daily encounters with racism in and outside of her community, sexism, classism, poverty, no family, no resources, very little education and English ability. She sometimes worked 3 jobs just to support us. We knew that life would have been easier for her if she had never had us. But she would always tell us what she hoped for us, that she hoped that we would have a better life than she had. So my life has been a series of trying to understand her and why she made the choices she did, what conditions, experiences, and circumstances limited the choices she had available. So even though I was born in Los Angeles during the Vietnam War era, my own life is intimately connected to the Camptown, symbolically and literally, like a strange umbilical cord that connects me here and there, one that I traverse whether I want to acknowledge it or not. It's a place that follows me because it's part of me. And over the last 13 years, it's been my work to try to understand those areas right outside the US bases, known as the Camptown or Dongdu Chun, and the people inside them. I've lived there on and off, conducted interviews, and searched through archives, media, policies, and legislative histories to try to put some of the pieces together. The Camptowns are places simultaneously layered with racism, sexism, imperialism, militarization, poverty, hushed secrets, labels, hatred, and abuse, as well as places of inspiring courage, of strength, of survival, of agency or our personal power, of resilience, hope, love, and beauty in the ugliest of places. My mother met our biological father in Chuncheon, my mom's hometown, at Camp Page. It's a U.S. military base that was there from 1951 until just a few years ago in 2005, but it left toxic chemical remains there after they closed the base that are 100 times over the permissible levels, poisoning the water and polluting the earth. So even as the U.S. military Camptown closures occur as a symbolic effort to give back the Republic of Korea that land, their toxicity and unresolved silences remain. It is up to us to tell those stories. So I reread Mr. Clement's book just a few weeks ago after reading something that Catherine Kim posted about his contributions to cover the cost of DNA tests for Korean Amerasian adoptees and war veterans, and was really hoping he'd be here today. Because this provides an important opportunity for many to release those silences, one that requires the courage of U.S. soldiers to acknowledge responsibility and the courage of adoptees to want to know. Even though U.S. citizenship law only grants citizenship to children of U.S. citizens until the age of 18, it will help many find resolution. So today, I'd like to humbly offer just bits of my own journey as a mixed Korean-American anthropologist and what I've learned from the people that I've had the honor of working with, and just to provide a brief historical context. But before we do that, I'd like to make a request. I'd like us to consider a call to action requested by Peter Kuchera. Peter Kuchera is a social worker who works with Filipino Amerasians. And what he calls out for is a pan-Amerasian movement that is inclusive of all, even those who remain in various parts of Asia, including those who immigrated through adoption or other immigration policies. Because are we not all part of the Asian diaspora? Are we not all part of Asian America? Are we all not all part of America and Korea and their respective histories? As we hear the many different stories today and the strength it takes to tell them, can we also ask how those stories connect us to others? Keith Basso, in his book Wisdom Sits in Places, describes through years of ethnographic research with the CBQ Apache that we are, in a sense, the place worlds we imagine. Imagine your Korea. That's the new motto of the Korean Ministry of Tourism. Who gets to imagine? Who gets excluded from that imagination? What are the everyday identity politics of place for Amerasians still there? The complex and intricate as well as intimate history of Korean Amerasians links them to the political, social, economic, and identity spaces beyond Korea. They navigate those terrains every day, which are interwoven with race, gender, and class, and former and current imperialisms, patriarchies, and paternalisms. What do they make of these places? What do you make of these places? Amerasian transnationals embody more than American blood, which for many is seen as a kind of imperial contamination, a miscegenation that symbolizes the weakness of Korea. Korean Amerasians have persisted despite their political and social invisibility and their experiences with discrimination from Korea and from the United States through everyday acts of agency. Agency meaning one's personal power to imagine or dream or act. Like James Scott's analysis of peasant dissidents in Malaysia in his book Weapons of the Weak, Korean Amerasians have an agency that seems almost minute, and so it's disregarded. But their power is like a steady stream that moves them forward, that keeps them going despite troubled waters. So this story begins in Korea, when Korea was not a divided country, but an occupied place by Japan, who ruled over the Korean people from 1910 to 1945. It stirred the creation of a pure-blood ideology among Koreans as a form of resistance to that occupation through the myth of Town Gon. And here he is, cutely depicted with his two hotties, that famous bear that won the contest, and the lovely tiger carnivore who would rather eat something other than garlic and mugwort. So I think it's really interesting to see a cartoon image of it, because there's nothing better that I think expresses a myth than a cartoon. But despite this cartoon that I've presented, there was a large-scale acceptance of this big H history and the invention of an exclusive notion of Koreanness that Korea is referred to as an ethno-nationalistic terrain, which views nation and race as the same, defining strict boundaries of group membership based on patriarchy in the name of a developing nation, in the name of resistance. It created a place of belonging. Walker Connor defines ethno-nation as a nation that emphasizes blood and race as markers of identity, much more than citizenship. Shin argues that race, ethnic nationalism, or minjok in Korea arose in response to the colonial racism as influenced by social Darwinism. But I would add that it was the U.S. military presence after 1945 and the U.S. structures of race that were witnessed and enacted in Korea that compounded the Korean notion of purity and status while privileging whiteness. And from this contact, U.S. notions of race and ethnicity have influenced and continue to influence Korean conceptions of race, particularly in the spatial and transnational context of the U.S. military Camptown areas, which places whiteness on top and blackness at the bottom, and further racializes and spatializes the placement of Amerasians in Korea. Positions of power with such a resonating racialized hierarchy were and are structural limitations to accessing Koreanness, as well as impediments to deeper changes within Korean society, despite the current rhetoric on multiculturalism. Some people and groups do not have a choice in how they're judged or ascribed. As my favorite mentor, Anya Peterson-Royce, once told me, you cannot legislate hearts. Another important recognition is the sexual relations between the groups has always been around, and so mixed folks like us have always been around too. The dynamic shifts, however, with power. In many ways, the central notion of family also played a major role in the concept and connection felt by Koreans as a microcosm of the state. Kinship and hometown locate us, like you were saying earlier. They locate us as an individual within the larger social fabric, cultural capital, and national discourse. Alongside with minjok and family, women's bodies were viewed as vessels of the nation state. Mixed Koreans and their marginalized space began in utero, inside Korean mothers who had violated rules of Koreanness through their sexual liaisons and ties with Western foreign male soldiers. So our journey continues with the U.S. landing and UN forces in Korea at the end of World War II in 1945. The actual first Amerasians were born in 1945 in Korea. But the Korean War left a legacy of destruction and devastation and the creation of U.S. military camptowns, some of which were historically former colonial military sexual complex areas of Japan during Japan's occupation of Korea. This is a picture of Dongdu Chun. Anybody from Dongdu Chun? Okay, that's where I do most of my work. In Dongdu Chun, when I was there in 2003, I mapped more than 75 nightclubs in a 2-block radius. I know, it's changed dramatically because there's a subway now. But in this 2-block area, it's rather conveniently located right outside the gates of Camp Casey. In an interview with an American who lived in Korea for a decade and was stationed there during his service in the U.S. Army, he said, he described his memories of TDC as the following. Anything went on in TDC, like Sodom and Gomorrah. It was a crazy place. He went on to talk about the segregation of the downrange area. On the larger left side, or right side, was the area designated for white soldiers, and a very small alley to the left, very, very tiny alley, that was the area designated for black soldiers. And this went on until the 1970s, and only changed because there were riots, race riots that were happening. But he recalled witnessing and hearing about those riots and the racial tension during that time. He went on to say that the large field exercises, when they would happen and more men were in the area, all of a sudden there would be more women, and there would be these little clubs that popped up that hadn't been there before. It was curious, he said. Now it's much more controlled from what I can see. He went on to describe how the Korean women who worked in the clubs tried to look whiter or blacker depending on their clientele, and how there was no crossing back once you went black. These areas began as intersections of the United States and the Republic of Korea, and they've expanded to become multi-ethnic spaces of interaction. The Camptown areas are not necessarily the sole location of the U.S.-ROK relationship on an individual level, nor are they the only places where Amerasians are born. They are areas central to identities where they are marked and perceived. Throughout U.S.-ROK history, these areas have undergone lots of changes, but they remain symbols of imperialism, of intrusion, power, and internalized shame. These places, like the women who have been there or work there or involved in with U.S. military men and their children, do not seem to change in the minds of many Koreans. And for many Americans, they are places that don't even exist. The people may grow to adulthood, they may move, experience different facets of life, but the images, stereotypes, and the positionality as something shameful and un-Korean remain. The images get tied to Amerasians like a string of words that cannot be separated in the Korean mind. Catherine Moon describes these areas as synonymous with prostitution, drunken U.S. soldiers, social deviance, and immorality. Since 1945, approximately 4 million U.S. and UN forces have been to Korea. About 30,000 troops are still there to the present day. During the Korean War, it was unknown how many people died, but estimates have been ranging from 2 to 5 million. And of that number, over 54,000 American military servicemen died, along with millions of Koreans whose stories we will never hear. The past is the past. Amerasians meeting their mothers after years of disconnect, or Amerasians who've always known their mothers, but desiring to know their stories and their histories, often get this response: it's the past. This adage is commonly used by Korean and Korean American women in particular, who have sought to start something new for themselves or want their children to start something new for themselves, that separates them from their histories, the negative associations and stereotypes related to Kijichun, GIs, and dirty work. The efforts to not revisit the past are revealed in the distinction between those women and us, reflected in Korean society in general, but also among Korean women who did marry officers or did marry GIs and immigrate to the United States, and those women who stayed. This distinction between Korean American women who have a history in Kijichun and Korean women who continue to live or work in Kijichun cannot be separated from one another, nor can it be separated from Amerasians born and or raised or adopted elsewhere. Even if a Korean woman and a non-Korean man did not meet in the Camptown or have any affiliations with the U.S. military, there's a link between all these groups. However, this connection does not mean that they see each other in a positive light or a similar light. There are times when similarities are made visibly apparent, but class, race, education, English abilities, physical appearance social networks, and experiences dictate associations with normal Koreans in the United States as well as in Korea. As a result, people create social support networks like themselves. Several scholars and women who've worked in the clubs of the Camptowns have called the Korean government one big pimp for the United States because they were called on and used as their bodies in service of the nation as what Catherine Moon calls intimate diplomats. Today, even though Korean women don't work in the clubs in the same positions they once did, they are aging and their health and resources are limited. Sunlit Sister Center, or Hesao Center, and director Woo Seon-deok in Anjong-mi tries to provide those missing resources and a place of community and advocacy near Camp Humphreys and the Osan Air Base. Many women are disconnected from their families spatially, emotionally, and physically for decades, some of them 50 plus years. The Camptown is their home. As one elder from the U.S. Camptown expressed, "It's better to be here with friends than to be alone. It's my home now." They've worked in the clubs as entertainers, but the Camptown has really changed a lot in the years that I've been working there. This is actually a scene, a picture from the Kijiton right outside Camp Humphreys. And what's changed is Filipinas have been working in the clubs as entertainers since the 2000s, human trafficked into these transnational spaces. So this story also travels to the United States and other Western countries and other parts of Asia, symbolically and literally. Thousands of mixed Korean adoptees were adopted to the United States beginning in 1950 that set into motion their own travel. A few hundred mixed Koreans immigrated to the United States as refugees after the Amerasian Active of 1982 was signed. Folks immigrated on their own, and thousands and generations of mixes of Amerasians still remain in Korea, many still in the Camptown. So you're probably confused about, well, who are Amerasians? Because I haven't really clearly told you who they are, even though I think a lot of us embody that identity. So Amerasians were better known as GI babies, war orphans, or even love child, and in the American media from 1945 until the 1980s. The local context, and I'm sure that many of you remember these names, local context made up their own names for children born to local women and their intimate relations with U.S. soldiers. The media accounts focused on adoption and victimization. The name Amerasian was actually coined by the famous novelist Pearl S. Buck, who, after her experiences in China and Japan and Korea, seeing mixed GI babies, she felt obligated to help them. And her way to help them, she saw, was international adoption. She opened the Welcome House adoption program in 1949, initially for the adoption of biracial children. And she says here in this quote, "I am compelled to the conclusion that the most needy children in the world are those born in Asia, whose mothers are Asian but whose fathers are American. They are a new group of human beings, a group that Asians don't know how to deal with, illegitimate as well as mixed in race. Our present project, therefore, is the Amerasian." Buck's description is much like the media and other accounts during that time, well-intentioned, but framed the way that Amerasians were viewed and represented. First off, she assumes that mixing never occurred when she calls them a new group of human beings. Secondly, she assumes that Asians don't know how to deal with them in a very patronizing way, as if Americans did know how to deal with them. Because, during this time it was also heavily racially segregated, right, in our society. Anti-miscegenation laws were in place. She never mentions the responsibility of the American fathers or the American government. She continues in this brief description to call them illegitimate, reinforcing stereotypes of prostituting mothers who didn't really want their children. She reinforces notions of race as biological. She further objectifies them by placing "the" in front of their name, calling them her project. Buck was not the only one to notice this new population. World Vision had also noticed and documented images from the devastation of the Korean War, which included war orphans, many of which were children born to local women in their relationships with NATO forces. In the fall of 1954, Bertha and Harry Holt attended a meeting held by World Vision in their hometown near Creswell, Oregon, where Bob Pierce, the founder of World Vision, was gathering sponsorships. I'm sure we'll hear more about this history from Dr. Kim's presentation. In May of 1955, Harry Holt flew to Korea as a missionary with a determined God-sent mission to save thy seed from the East, paving the way for international proxy adoption, and later founding the Holt Adoption Agency. How many of you were adopted from Holt, out of curiosity? Okay. How many of you were adopted from the Pearl S. Buck Foundation, through the Pearl S. Buck Foundation? And then St. Vincent's Home for Amerasians. So the Holts, just like everyone else during that particular period of time, saw that the immediate resolution to this GI baby problem was adoption, get them out. And this would haunt Korea and their families and these individuals for decades to come. Amerasians are seen in a fixed, timeless view as children and victims, perpetuated over time, even amongst the few who have heard of this concept. Social workers at that time, up until the 1970s, described their work to me as baby hunting to find blonde-haired babies in the Camptowns, pleading with mothers to relinquish their children for a better life in America, where they belonged. This experience connected Amerasians within a social, political, economic sphere within the international realm. The exploitation of local women by the U.S. and Korean governments, and thereby its soldiers, was left out of all of this narrative. In 1964, Buck expanded her foundation into what is currently known as the Pearl S. Buck Foundation, and in 1965, she opened the Opportunity Center in Bucheon, South Korea, to provide housing, education, and resources and skills to Amerasians, shifting the focus away from adoption to integration into Korea. The Pearl S. Buck Foundation International Korea is still in operation. Its actual home base now is in Bucheon at the historic Welcome House. But they provide resources still today to Amerasians, but their focus has also shifted because of the changing demographic within Korea that looks more at other mixes of Koreanness. Since 2001, inter-country adoption has also been more acceptable, so the numbers of international adoptions have dwindled. But Korean Amerasian adoption drastically decreased much earlier than that for various reasons. But the economy was better, and Korean women were less willing to give up their children, even if they were mixed. Last summer, I conducted a new project on elderly women in the Camptown and their bucket list. It was a very difficult project emotionally, but what often surfaced for several of the women who participated in my little project was a reference to their children who they'd given up for adoption. Many of these women are 70, 80, 90 years old, and they know that they'll never see their children again. One woman put it this way. She said, "My only wish is that my daughter is happy and healthy and has a good life." During the 1970s, other political options were being explored, like folks like Father Keane and the Pearl S. Buck Foundation both testified with Amerasians from Korea for a bill that would give Amerasians all across Asia the ability to immigrate to the United States as citizens if they wanted. So while Father Keane was trying to advocate for this, Father Zweber and Mr. Saw were all in Korea working with other Korean Amerasians to try to legislate for this policy. Also, alongside that, the Pearl S. Buck Foundation in Korea and Jodi Dara were also proposing a Senate bill simultaneously with this House bill. But what happened was not exactly what they were hoping for. In October 1982, President Reagan signed into law the Amerasian Active 1982. And this provides immigration as refugees to certain Amerasian children. If you were born in Cambodia, Korea, Laos, Thailand, or Vietnam after December 31st, 1950, and before October 22nd, 1982. And you also had to prove that you were fathered by a U.S. citizen. And I want to put out there that if you could prove you were fathered by a U.S. citizen, wouldn't that automatically make you a citizen? So it's not exactly what they were hoping for. It also denies and ignores so many other people and places throughout the world. I'm going to skip through this. But the U.S. Military and government have basically divided the world according to this map. And I want to show you this map because when we think about Camptowns in Korea, there's so many other Camptowns throughout the world. And historically, for example, does anybody know when the first military base was established in the Philippines? 1898. There are hundreds of thousands of generations of mixed Filipino-American Amerasians that are still being born today. So when we think about kind of this history, right, I think that that's really critical to think about. So they've been in the Philippines since 1898, Guam since 1944, Japan and Korea since 1945, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand during the Vietnam War eras, China in the 1940s. More recently, there's a presence in Singapore and Indonesia. So if we look at these places, do they not also hold a similar history for Amerasians? Why aren't they included? Filipino Amerasians have organized an official International Amerasian Day on March 4th of every year since 2001, inclusive of all. This day is recognized by the Filipino government as a national holiday. This is a tremendous act of agency because, as you can see from that act, they are excluded, even though they're the most historic. And so when we think about this, right, this mapping, I think that there's a lot for us to consider, and even in our discussion today. I want to show you this very popular culture kind of clip, poster from Missing in Action 3. Anybody see this movie? I don't think so. You did? Okay. I've never met anybody who watched it besides me. But there are lots of popular culture references to Amerasians, and just like in here, where it says on the very top corner, he's fighting for everyone who can't fight back. And if anybody's interested in learning more about this movie, I encourage you to watch it. But many Americans are surprised to hear about Amerasians, as if they could never conceive of their boys, U.S. soldiers, getting involved with Asian women when they're stationed overseas, let alone having children with them. Still more difficult for many Americans to understand is why they wouldn't take care of their children, whether they were legitimate or not. But our births locate us. They locate us not only into a family and a larger society, but also a place with structural and institutional power over us. As Foucault writes, we live within webs of power linked to the nation state and civil society. The representations of popular culture and media and policy do not fairly represent Amerasians. So, who are Amerasians? I want to give you my definition. They are the descendants of an Asian woman and a U.S. soldier who were and are born in Asia. This might seem like a very general definition, but one I feel is essential because of the necessity to be inclusive. Not only of places, but also of generations of mixedness and their transnational links. So here's an example from today. There are children born to Filipino women who've been trafficked to Korea, and they have sexual relations with a U.S. soldier, some of whom are not even U.S. citizens. The United States has a military presence all over the globe, and you don't have to be a U.S. citizen to be a U.S. soldier. But their presence in Asia has been historic. Right? So when we think about these things, the interconnections of place and Amerasian identity has always been a focus of my work, but it came to a head for me when I met with Milton's father and mother for the second time at their home, and I hope they don't mind that I share this story. But they adopted 3 Black Korean children from St. Vincent's Home for Amerasians. Both of them grew up in Texas during segregation. Mr. Washington was first stationed in Korea during the Vietnam War, and his duty station was actually my mom's hometown, Camp Page. He was later stationed in different parts of Korea several times, and they met with Father Keene because Milton's mom had heard about the experiences of mixed Koreans, especially Black Koreans. And Mr. Washington was recalling a story. He said, "I can't say I knew Father Keane very well, but I do remember him saying that Amerasians will always want to come back to Korea to search for their history, and there will be none." After a pregnant pause, he looked at me and he shook his head while saying, "Shackles without chains." He was right about the lack of history, but was he right about the shackles? He was right about thinking about this missing history, right? But were they shackles at all that connected Korean Amerasians, adopted or otherwise, to this place called Korea? Was it something else? Was it that place is as much a part of us as we are part of it? Placemaking is about asking questions. What happened here? Who's involved? What was it like? Why should it matter? William Chapman writes that the past is at its best when it takes us to places that counsel and instruct, that show us who we are by showing us where we've been, that remind us of our connections to what happened here. It's about constructing a history, a narrative of identity through cartography. The Camptown, Korea, the United States are part of those cartographies of who we are. Joel Balul calls this the architecture of memory, where the poetics of remembrance requires one to build and rebuild. It is a process that is imagined, according to Benedict Anderson in his analysis of nationness and nationalism, that commands a deep emotional attachment. Koreanness is imagined. It's imagined as an exclusive body, but it is one that Korean Amerasians contest, challenge, and assert as theirs through everyday acts of agency. They cross complex cartographies like we're doing today. Today we are reimagining and rebuilding our Korea. Thank you.